Hi. We're going to do chapter 11. I was confused between 10 and 11 there for a minute. Let me adjust this real quick. It's still a little. There, perfect. Actually, there we go. And so tonight we're going to be doing a shorter chapter. We're just going to do one chapter. But this chapter is really chock full of stuff with about Saul and becoming king, and I'm really excited about this chapter. I do like this chapter a lot. Obviously, my little partner in crime is not in. She is hanging out with Grandma and Grandpa, and so Ava, if you're watching, hello and I love you. Make sure you're being good. For a baby update, I don't know the size of Noah at this point, other than we just entered 35 weeks, as you've probably heard from Pastor Scott on church this morning. We are pretty close, and we're worried he's going to come early. We have an appointment tomorrow. The doctor has said, if Danielle's progressed to a certain point, they're going to admit her to the hospital. We don't know. We don't think that means they're going to induce her because we couldn't imagine them inducing a woman at 35 weeks premature. But we're concerned with that. Danielle doesn't want to be in the hospital any longer than she has to. She doesn't want to be away from us, and she doesn't want to be somewhere with COVID exposure either. So we're being very cautious, and I think we're going to try our best. If for some reason they say you need to be in, I think Danielle's going to very politely kind of push back and see if she can at least come home to stay here. But we're getting pretty close. I don't think Danielle and I are pretty certain we're not going to get a baby full term, and neither does the doctor. And they've started her on steroids to boost his lungs and get some more baby fat on him. So he's getting a little better, or he's getting bigger probably than when he would normally at 35 weeks. But we want him in there as long. Like I said, we don't think we're going to get him to full term, but we would be really happy if we can get him at least through week 36, which is what we're really hoping for, which would be next Sunday. And so we're like I said, we're getting really close, and so we appreciate all the thoughts and prayers, and we really appreciate everything that everyone's done for us and the thoughts and the concerns. So thank you to everybody. We're going to go ahead where I did say this is a short chapter. We're going to just read the whole chapter and talk about it in one fell swoop. So at the beginning of chapter 11, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite said, "We will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days, so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. So then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They told the messengers who had come, "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." When the messengers went and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like." The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that no two of them were left together. The people said then to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Turn these men over to us, so that we may put them to death." But Saul said to them, "No, no one will be put to death today, for this is the day the Lord has rescued Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal, and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. And so, if you were confused a little bit by it seems like we're reaffirming him as king. We're going to kind of walk through that whole process as we talk through this chapter because what we've now seen is about 3 chapters of Saul sort of being confirmed as king in various factions and forms. The first time talking to Samuel, the second time through the lots, and now this third time as he goes to war. And so, if you're confused by why we keep seeing Saul being made king in some ways, you're probably not alone because it took me a little while here. And so, again, this is going to be a lot of stuff that's kind of my opinion only, but my thought process as I read through it and taking the context clues. And we're going to walk through each of those and step by step to kind of walk through what I think is happening with Saul here and with Israel as a whole. So first off, what we see is we see that there's the Ammonites besiege a city called Jabesh Gilead. And before we even talk more about the chapter, let's talk about what a siege would really be like. Most recordings that we have of sieges is something that to this extent, an army will surround the city. Depending on the age, they would entrench it. Um, Sometimes they would bring in machinery to help bring down walls because most of the cities at this time had walls. They would do there'd be various mechanisms they would use to, besiege it and then hold it. Or sometimes if the army was really large and they didn't think anyone was coming to the rescue, they would just surround it and make sure nobody could come in or out. And the idea is kind of twofold. One, the idea is to starve them, or two, to get them to surrender. One thing that's pretty common with most sieges is there is a negotiation with the people within the city, and we actually see that at the beginning here. So it's pretty common for whoever is captured in the city to actually have a negotiation. It's actually pretty common for the people, the besiegers, to ask for a negotiation treaty, and it makes a lot of sense for 2 reasons. One, you don't want to be in the city besieged. You will starve to death if there's no peace. Or two, if they storm you, and the rules of war generally have said that if an army has to storm the city after besieging it, there's no mercy. Everyone is killed, everything is looted, everything's gone. So there is some motivation. If you don't think you're going to be rescued, there's a real motivation um, to surrender at that point in time. Likewise, for the people besieging the city, there's a reason to negotiate there because if you've ever read any recollection or any historical recordings of sieges and an attempt to capture a city that's besieged, especially a walled city, it is tough, it is deadly, and it's not certain. And so the Ammonites likely don't want to run the risk of losing their people. There are recordings, especially in some of the Napoleonic Wars with the Duke of Wellington. There's some recordings of um, besiegings where the Duke of Wellington tried to capture some Spanish forts and would lose half, if not more, of his men. In fact, an old rule of soldiery in the British Empire back in that day that if you were part of the first group of people to try and go into a besieged city and you survived that besieging, you actually got to wear a special badge and you got instantly promoted. The reason they did that is because it was impossible to get volunteers to actually be the first ones into a city because you were so likely to be killed. It was near impossible to survive. So to make people go to their near certain deaths, the only motivation was if you survive, you're promoted, and you wear a badge that no one else can wear. And so there were some real special benefits. That's how deadly it was. And so that's the reasoning why there's so much push here to negotiate. And so they negotiate, and they say, we will be okay. We would be ready to be subjects of you. That's what this city says. But unfortunately for them, the Ammonites have it one step further. They say, we'll take your surrender, but we're going to gouge one eye out of every one of you. Now, one, that'd be horribly painful, but two, there's actually a bigger symbolic significance to that. And what that is in most modern or most ancient times, if you were considered mutilated, you were not able to inherit anything from your family or from anyone else, actually. And so, like for example, in Roman times or in medieval times, when there was fights over an inheritance, especially for lordships or for kingships, one of the ways to destroy the other line wasn't necessarily to kill the person, but to gouge an eye, take an arm, take a leg, take something, mutilate them, and that person was considered no longer a right to rule or no longer a right to inherit. And so by gouging the eye out of every one of these people, including the children, what would happen is when these people died out, their inheritance would all go to the Ammonites at that point in time. So it was more than just an eye gouging. It was actually a way to completely wipe them out and take all of their possessions at the same time over one generation of time. So in other words, what they were sort of saying is you can surrender to us, but only this generation gets anything out of it with their lives. Everyone else doesn't. And that's what we see here. And so they actually make a deal and say, listen, let us send messengers. If we hear nothing for 7 days, we will do it. And that's actually a pretty common negotiating tactic, too. And so they besiege the city and they're going to wait 7 days. And now we turn to the messengers arriving to, to Saul and to his people. And so they bring this message. And we actually start with, as he gets the message, we hear that he's actually in the farm, on the farm with his oxen and working as in the farm. And this kind of struck me as unusual, given the fact that he's now king, and he doesn't necessarily need to do his own work. Now, the more non-cynical side of me says, well, this is just him showing humility and still showing the importance of work, and that may very well be. But I do have another thought process here, and part of the thought process here kind of ties with all of the context clues we have about Saul being king. He's already been confirmed a king at this point, and yet here we see him still working in the field. And then we later see them reconfirm him as king later, and him agreeing to being reconfirmed as king. And so here is my thought process. He was still reluctant at this point to take up the responsibility of being the king of Israel. Remember that when he was confirmed through picking of lots, they found him hidden among the supplies, as if he didn't want to become king. And actually, the responses he had to Samuel, when Samuel said, "You will be king," he seemed very reluctant. He says, "Why would you say that to me? How could I become king?" And now we see him confirmed as king, but instead of ruling the government, he's tilling the fields. It makes me feel like he's still trying to shirk that responsibility, which comes to, I think, one of the very first points we should talk about here. When God lays a responsibility on you, you can't run away from it. It seems like Saul's really trying to run away from being king and being taken from that responsibility. And there are certainly times I think where all of us actually run away from the responsibility that God gives to us. But what we see here is when God has a plan for you, He has a plan for you. And as much as you want to shirk away from it, that responsibility will be there. That obligation will be there. There's a quote, and I don't know the quote perfectly, but there's a quote from a person dealing with kind of punctuality and procrastinating that actually says, you know, time does not remove the responsibility of today. And what it was really trying to say was, you can sit there and not do it today, but tomorrow the responsibility still lays there. And that's the same for Saul here, and it's the same for each and every one of us with whatever responsibility we have in the church or in our lives. We can't shirk away from it. It will not just go away. We must embrace it. We must take it. And so we see that spirit again comes on Saul in a fire and an anger, and he sends the message and chops up the oxen and says, "This is what will happen to every oxen of every person who does not meet my call." And the response is great. And obviously, we see that Israel believes in his authority because over 300,000 Israelites and over 30,000 people from Judah come and actually make up the army. And so they send the message to Jabesh Gilead. It says, by the time of noon tomorrow, by the time the sun is high, you will be free. And so they bring the army up and they bring a camp. Now I do wonder if the camps of the Ammonites and the Israelites was close enough that actually the Ammonites could see them, and maybe they were expecting a negotiation between the camp with the Ammonites eventually breaking camp. But we actually see something different happen. What we see is the sun sets and both armies are in their camps. And at the very last part of the night watch during the night, the Israelites get up and they have a night attack on the camp of the Ammonites. It's a sneak attack, and it works, and they pretty much just annihilate the entire camp of the Ammonites. And I was wondering why they did this at this time. In ancient history, night attacks like this weren't necessarily considered honorable. They were highly effective, but they may not be considered honorable at the time. And so I'm kind of left with a couple thoughts of why they may have went down that route. Um, the Ammonites might have still actually outnumbered the Israelites. It's hard to imagine the Ammonites having an army bigger than 330,000. That's a massive army. Just to give you context, um, the armies at Gettysburg combined, both the Union and the Confederates, those two armies combined roughly totaled 220 to 230,000, maybe a little more than that. So just the Israeli army, the Israelites army at this point in time is actually bigger than the combination of the Union and the Confederate armies that clashed at Gettysburg. And so this is a huge army. It's hard to imagine that they did. Um, but nonetheless, the Ammonites might have actually outnumbered them, and so they were worried about going into a battle if the Ammonites decided that they were going to actually stand and besiege the city. The second answer might have been that the Ammonites have been raiding and doing this work, sort of raiding and sieging a lot of different points at this time. And so this was a perpetual problem that if they just made a negotiation one way, the Ammonites were going to show back up later on. And that's kind of that's what I actually think was likely happening here, is that the Ammonites have been a thorn in the side of the Israelites for a while, doing this sort of tactic. And the Israelites said, we're going to fight them once and for all, we're going to annihilate them, and we're going to put an end to this problem. And I think that's probably what they did. Night attacks are highly risky, by the way, in history. There's a lot of really famous generals who refused to do night attacks because of how dangerous they were, because the communication was difficult, it was hard to coordinate, especially if you have an army this big. It's really hard, and at some point you might actually make the mistake of getting in the wrong direction or actually fighting your own people. So it's a very highly dangerous, but if successful, highly effective. And that's what we actually see here. We see that they're so highly effective that it actually says that by noon the next day, they're completely dispersed, and no two people of the Ammonites are together. That's how well they disperse them and separate them and annihilate them and keep the camp. And so we now see Saul has rescued Jabesh Gilead and ended the siege. And as we see at the end, we see where they reconfirm him as king. And what I wonder if this is the moment right here where Saul himself now accepts the responsibility of being king, that he now understands fully in his soul that he is the king of Israel, that he is going to be the ruler, because this seems to be kind of the end of this issue of him not doing what seems to be the kingly level of responsibility. And I think this is where that moment happens. And so the first thing we see as he's now sort of taken up the full reins of king is we see some people say, hey, where are those people who said, why shall Saul reign over us? Let's turn these people over and let's put them to death. And Paul says, no one will be put to death today, for this is the day the Lord has rescued Israel. And this sounds like a person that, one, is now confident in his own authority, that he's confident that he is king of Israel and that he has the support, and for good reason. If he had 330,000 come to his call, he probably feels comfortable with where he now sits in this world, and he is reconciling himself to this. And I think this is a good point for reconciliation for all of us. These people did a real personal disservice to Saul. They did a disservice to God as well by shirking the person who God named king of Israel. But Saul, instead of being vengeful to the people of Israel that were denying him, he actually says, no one's going to be put to death today. Let's reconcile, because this is a greater day that the Lord rescued Israel. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember. People are going to wrong us all the time, and one of the most important messages we have throughout the Bible, all throughout it, from Jesus to Saul to so many other people, we see reconciliation. Holding a grudge does nothing but poison us in the future, and there's nothing good that comes with poisoning ourselves with the hatred of someone who had wronged us previously. It does us no good to hold on to it. We must release it and reconcile. And I think that's what we see Saul doing now as king. And so Saul says to them, let's go to Gilgal and there renew the kingship. And so they went to Gilgal, made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. Then they sacrificed and they held a celebration. And so now we see sort of the final discussion of Saul being king and renewing it. I think he even knew it this beforehand. I think he even knew he was likely shirking the duties that God placed upon him. And we see now him changed and say, now let's renew the kingship, renew it for you and renew it for me, that I am king. And we will see now him reign as king going forward. And so I will say, we see him now in the certainty of his position. But what we will say is this personality of him being tepid about kingship and tepid about his position. This will continue throughout the book. As we know, he's going to see a lot of jealousy in someone else who he thinks wants to be king now that he is king. And so the insecurity that Saul holds about being king isn't necessarily completely extinguished because we see his apprehension later on. But we see for this moment, he's finally taken the responsibility that God's given him, and the people there follow. And we see the blessings of what happens when he takes the responsibility that God gives him, and sees that he's able to have success. And I think that's important for us to remember, that for us to be successful, we have to accept that responsibility that Jesus gives us. And in fact, without accepting that responsibility, it's going to be hard for any of us to truly be successful in life and successful in where God wants us to be. Let's pray. Father, thank you for another week. Thank you for getting my family through another week with Noah staying put, and thank you for just letting us all have another week on this earth. As I think that's always a blessing to each and every one of us. Thank you for my church family and for all the love and support they've given us during this time. We've been doing a lot of our service virtually in my family, but that's not hindered the love that we feel from our church family, and that just shows your love through them in a way that just amazes me and amazes Danielle and Ava, and we can't express how thankful we are for them and for you. Thank you for just helping us to be guided by you, and for coming and saving us. There's a lot of times where I think all of us don't want the responsibility that you want to give us, and just let us see this story of Saul, these last couple chapters of Saul, and realize that when you want us to do something, there's nothing we can do to shirk that responsibility. You've given it to us, just like you've given us blessings, and we need to take it and serve you with that responsibility. And we need to understand that it won't go away, but the anxiety of not taking up that responsibility will stay there until we really take up what you want us to do. Please watch over all of us over this week. For me personally, if you can give us another week with Noah staying put, we'd be really helpful. If we can keep Danielle out of the hospital, we'd really appreciate it. And just be with everyone in our community. There's a lot of people going to school. There's a lot of teachers that are anxious. Watch over them, protect them, and help them. And let us all do our parts to protect each other during this time. Help the vaccines that are coming around. Help them to get to people as quick as possible. And thank you for the speed that it has came out here in West Virginia, at least, compared to other states. Thank you for that speedy distribution. And just help us all to be able to get there as soon as possible. We ask for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thank you guys again. Like I said, it was a bit of a shorter message tonight, but I really appreciate your time. And by way of announcements, next week at 10:45, we always have our worship service. My plan is to be on at 6 p.m. If Noah comes and makes it so I can't do a recording early or can't go live, I will let everyone know. Like I said, we are literally kind of going minute by minute, hour by hour right now. So, again, thank you all for your thoughts and prayers. Thank you for everyone who's reached out to us. We are so grateful for everyone and the love you guys have shown. Have a great evening, and I hope we will see you again next Sunday. Thank you.